Hey guys, welcome back to chapter 37. We're taking a look at the end of some empire. We're taking a look at decolonization and a lot of other things. So let's jump right in. I'm going to try to get this whole thing done in one video. So let's get this party started. So, one of the big movements right after World War II was the independence of India. Of course, the British have ruled India all the way since the 7 Years' War extension in India against England and France in the 1750s. So we're talking close to 200 years of Indian domination by the British, and India wants to break up, and we're going to see how that works out. And then we got decolonization of Africa. Remember, in the 1940s, World War II, there was only two countries in Africa. That was Liberia and Ethiopia. Everything else, every other square inch of Africa was ruled by a colonial power from Europe. And then we're going to see a little bit of Islamic resurgence in the 70s, where a lot of countries kind of reverted back to more fundamental Islamic rule. So decolonization in Asia, we can see some of the independence dates of some of these places. There's the partition of India, broke up into three parts. You got India, which is a Hindu nation. And then when they broke up, they wanted, there was a lot of Muslims, and the Muslims wanted a homeland of their own that would be under Islamic law. And so you get Pakistan and East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. Myanmar gets independence, you can see right there too. The French eventually pull out of southeastern Europe into Indochina, and you get the nations of Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. The Dutch, they're done in Indonesia. You can see the date right there after World War II, and that becomes independent nation. Singapore gets independence. The Philippines, once again, is liberated after the war, as well as Papua New Guinea. So the big thing in India, they want home rule. But of course, we know that Indians, for the most part, are Hindu. Most, about 80%, are Hindu. And so they practice the concept of ahimsa, and that means they can't fight their way through to independence. And so they got to do it the old way, and that is through boycotts and through sit-ins and peaceful protests and just simply social resistance. They're just going to stop playing the game and just make the British lose so much money that they just decide to just leave. However, in this process, there's a lot of Muslims who don't want to live in a Hindu nation and Hindus who don't want to live in a Muslim nation. And so now you get this mass migration of people moving through, and there's a little bit of violence in the process. Muhammad al Jinnah ran the Muslim League and said, we want a country for Muslims. And so they created the nation of Pakistan. Jawaharlal Nehru becomes president of, he was from the Indian National Congress. He becomes president of India. A lot of people wanted Gandhi to do it, but by this time Gandhi's like 78, 79 years old, and it just wasn't going to work for him. In the process of this kind of separation, a lot of people died. There was a lot of violence, and a lot of people were refugees. If you can call them refugees, they're just moving from one part of India to the other. A lot of them, I'm not going to say by force, but they were most certainly encouraged to go to the other side if they belonged over there, according to the people who kicked them out. So we're going to see in Vietnam, we know, of course, the French reassert their control after World War II. But then you get a lot of communist influence. Once China goes communist, they're going to push their communist influence all the way down to Vietnam. And they set up a young charismatic leader by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who wants to turn Vietnam communist. And after the Geneva Conference, Vietnam is split into two parts, the North and the South, communist and not communist. And that begins USA's involvement because, of course, they know that the North is definitely threatening the South to go all communist. And so policy containment, the United States has to get involved. They don't really have a choice in this matter. And so they're going to set up the Bank of Vietnam. They're going to set up a leader of South Vietnam who's definitely going to be friendly to the United States and that they know isn't going to go communist. In Palestine, of course, we know all about the violence that's going on in Palestine, Israel today, between Israel and Gaza. But that violence has been going on for a very long time. After the war, we know that victims of the Holocaust were upwards near 6, 7 million plus million. A lot of refugees. A lot of Jews went back to their homeland that the British uh, got control of after the Ottoman Empire ceded that territory to them after World War One. And the whole idea was to create a homeland for Jews and for the Palestinians who had moved in the last few hundred years. However, during that time, um, the Arab communities didn't want any Jews to have a homeland there. They believed that that was their territory. They'd had it for the last 1,000 years or more. And so they were opposed to any Jewish state. Well, when the UN supports it, the United States and Russia and most of Western Europe supports it, it's going to lead to some violence and conflict. And there's been violence and conflict since the day after Israel became a state in 1947. Very much opposed. And so when Israel was created, they created the nation of Israel and the nation of Palestine, independent of each other. But that was not acceptable to the Palestinian leaders and most of the Arab community. And so they attacked Israel on three sides the very next day. And Israel beat them all. And over the course of the next 50 years, it happened time and time again. Israel won every time because they had superior weaponry, superior military, and they're buying all their stuff from the United States and Russia. And we can see that over the course, Israel took some Palestinian territory, gave it back, took it again, gave it back, etc. Took some Egyptian territory when Egypt attacked the 6 Day War, and they gave it back. So we can see that kind of a long history of violence in this part of the world. Egypt and Arab nationalism, Gamal Abdel Nasser, he takes over leadership in the late 1950s and wants to nationalize the Suez Canal. The Brits own the Suez Canal. They want to get it. And he started looking at maybe going communist for a little while, cozied up with the Soviets. Soviets built the Aswan Dam, and then he kind of ended up not going communist, and it was just kind of a weird situation in Egypt. But anyway, so the Arab-Israeli conflict right here from 49 to 82, we won't include anything that happened after that, but you can see here what the original territory of Israel was in the original Palestine. Here's the West Bank, Golan Heights. Here's Gaza, this little chunk right down here, and then Israel all the way through here. It eventually got pushed into nothing for Palestinians except for the West Bank and Gaza, and the Golan Heights became part of Syria. But over the years, it changed with different wars, things like that. And then all this territory was ceded during the 6 Day War and given back a few years later. You can see here there's different independence dates for these nations in Africa, when they got independence, where they got independence from, Great Britain, France, Italy, etc. There's even one colony from Spain right down here, Equatorial Guinea. A lot of people don't know Spain had a colony in Africa. And we'll spend a little bit more time doing that when we get to the Jamboard. So go ahead and go to the Jamboard, fill this out along the way, and don't forget to do all that. However, in this colonial rule, remember Africa has been colonized now for well over, at this point, close to 100 years. And when the powers that be got together to decide, what country is going to be what, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, one, they didn't invite any Africans, and two, they really didn't take into consideration a lot of ethnic boundaries and histories and linguistic boundaries, religion, tribal expectations, et cetera, and just started creating these nations. Sometimes where the national border runs right through the middle of a town, and it was really kind of messy the way that a lot of these kind of finished, and there's still a lot of unresolved conflict in Africa today because of the haste that these people took in creating these places. There's a lot of African nationalism. Remember, there's a lot of Africans who ended up going to college and being, going for higher education in their colonial host lands, back to England, back to France, back to Spain, back to Italy, whatever, getting a first-rate education, coming back and realizing, wow, we can do better. And now they rise up as the next generation of leaders to work toward independence movements. And some of those people like Nelson Mandela, Jomo Kenyatta, and some of these other people um, ended up really working hard and eventually gaining that independence. And there's a lot of implications with that because now these new African nations are quite vulnerable to the takeover of communism and socialism. And the rest of the Western world spends a whole lot of money to keep them from going communist in a lot of places. Ghana was one of the first ones, 1957. Ghana was a British colony, and Kwame Nkrumah was one of the first. Queen Elizabeth went down there and said, "Hey, you want to be independent?" And they said, "Yeah." In Kenya, you can see there was a lot of fighting, 12,000 Africans, 100 Europeans. During this time, going back to 52, it was bloody. Some places not so much, but eventually got independence in 1963. In South Africa, of course, we know was through the Boer Wars. We had Dutch, we had German, we had Brits, plus all the local African groups, Zulus, you name it, all the way through. And Africa's rich, South Africa's rich in natural resources, and that's been the source of a lot of conflict throughout the years. They had their African National Congress. They wanted to push a charter through. Nelson Mandela spoke out vehemently against the apartheid and really the subjugation of Black Africans because South Africa was independent, but it was still ruled by white European colonists who were born in South Africa, but pretty much ran the whole show, even though they only made up about 10 to 15% of the population. And there was widespread discrimination, etc. And Nelson Mandela, who spent most of his adult life in jail, eventually was kind of the face of this anti-apartheid movement. And eventually they elected him president. They let him go in 1990, and then in 1994, new elections, and a lot of Black Africans were elected into governmental positions. The difference between the southern states and South African apartheid, and we'll go through this in class. I'm not going to do it right now. In China, what's going on over here? Well, we see that China now is run by Mao after the war, and it goes communist, and he starts his little 5-year plans. And they're a total disaster. What we see is hundreds of thousands of Chinese dying of starvation because he tries to get the government to tell farmers what to farm. Instead of letting farmers farm what they want to farm and let the market decide, he decides that some schmo from Beijing is smarter about telling people how to farm than the farmers, and it's really a mess. And it gets into the Cultural Revolution, where it's basically a purge. They call it the Cultural Revolution, but really it was a purge of anything that wasn't Maoist. Ends up being marginalized from society. People get thumped, people get jailed, people get killed, people get excommunicated, blacklisted, you name it. If they didn't get on board and get on the train, they were their lives were destroyed. Eventually, Mao dies. You got a new guy, Deng Xiaoping, comes into power. And he sort of softened up a little things, quite a few things. And the more he softened up, the more people want it. And then you get the Tiananmen Square rallies and all that. And China starts to take notice that, the next generation is, taking a look at television saying, the rest of the world's doing a little better than we are. How come we're not better? In India, of course, you get Indira Gandhi, the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, no relation to Mohandas Gandhi. A lot of people think, but he wasn't. And she starts to promote this green revolution, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in class. And eventually, they attack and they kill her. She's assassinated. And a lot of other places have this what they call Islamic resurgence, and a lot of negative jibe toward the United States. And a lot of these countries go a little bit more fundamental Islamic, in some cases, run by people that would be labeled as extremists. And one of the big ones was what happened in Iran. And we'll go through that a little bit more in class. This guy, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and the Shah. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Hostages in Iran, things like that. Iran and Iraq are going to fight for about 10 years over, it's a Shia, Sunni, Muslim kind of a thing. But Iraq, of course, is led by this lunatic Saddam Hussein, and eventually he's going to go into Kuwait and start the Gulf War. We'll get to that a little bit more in class. So partition, what we got India versus Hindu versus Muslim, and we ended up with 3 countries out of it. Big concerns is how do we take care of the people that were there and respect their wishes, and then some Islamic resurgence. A lot of it had to do with anti-American policy and just different leadership and influence. So there it is. We did it in one. Thanks, guys. See you in the next one.